Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Remember 3 years ago when Ontario was in the midst of an election where Premier Doug Ford was leading the Progressive Conservatives of Ontario and delivered a crushing defeat to Kathleen Wynne's Liberals after a 15-year Liberal reign in Ontario? Remember how Doug Ford championed that he would bring an end to the culture of waste and mismanagement and to get Ontario out of the red within his first mandate? Well, I sure remember that. After all, I was a candidate in the PC party leadership race and was nominated candidate in that election, for a while at least. Well, it appears the Doug Ford government's fiscal plan, post-election in 2021, is really not that much different than the Liberals. Be it spending, deficits, or debt, there really has been very little difference between the Liberals and the Progressive Conservatives. And some argue that the PCs are in fact doing an even worse job than the Liberals. And that is excluding the COVID spending. So how is that even possible? And what will it take to rein in this spiraling debt and seemingly out of reach balanced budget? Well, joining me now to help us unpack just what is going on with Ontario's debt and spending is Ben Eisen, Senior Fellow with the Frasier Institute. Ben, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So this issue I'm obviously keenly interested in as a resident of Ontario, and also because I was, acutely interested in politics, especially during this time. So just to provide some context for our viewers, so at the time of 2018 election, the previous Wynne government was spending about $40 million a day, more than it was collecting in revenue. We had the largest sub-sovereign debt. Fill in the gaps for me here, just so our viewers understand.
Yeah, by the time, by the 2018 period, Ontario's fiscal circumstances were bad, for lack of a better or more descriptive word, and they'd been getting progressively worse for a very long period of time, particularly since the recession of 2008, 2009. Ontario was perennially running multi-billion-dollar deficits every single year. Mm-hmm. There was no concerted effort to shrink the deficit quickly. The sort of governing philosophy was we'll try to slow down spending compared to how we were before the recession, and gradually the deficit will shrink over time. Well, that worked in that the deficit started to shrink a little, but all the while debt was piling up more and more and more because there was no effort to actually eliminate the deficit. So debt was piling up quickly, starting around 2008, 2009, all the way through to 2018, by which point Ontario's overall debt had grown, its debt relative to the size of the economy had grown, its debt relative to other provinces in Canada had grown. And in short, the fiscal situation in the province had gotten much, much worse. So that brings us to 2018, an election in which the Ford party then running for office, as you say, made a firm commitment. In fact, a central promise of their election campaign was to change course, to take a different approach to deficit and debt, and to fix essentially the problem that they inherited. Now, so that's where we were in 2018, facing a very serious fiscal situation, an election largely based on that fiscal situation, and a change in government.
So your report, or you wrote a report that suggests that the Doug Ford government has, in fact, made it worse, like that spending has actually gone farther. Just to rule this out with our viewers, and I said this in my intro, this is excluding COVID spending, am I right?
Yeah, it's non-COVID. The budget, for all of its shortcomings, the most recent budget, it does have some good accounting practices, including separating out the COVID, the one-time emergency COVID spending, as well as separating out emergency grants from the federal government to deal with COVID. So we're really able to make apples and apples comparisons over time. And the government does deserve credit for that transparency in their accounting in the budget. But when we look at it, we see something pretty clear. And it's the same thing we were starting to see before COVID emerged, which is despite wildly different rhetorical styles. Kathleen Wynne and Doug Ford, they don't talk the same way. They don't talk the same way about government. They're hard to mistake for one another at a glance. But in reality, their approach to fiscal governance has been very similar. Both of them had situations in which they faced undoubtedly difficult fiscal circumstances, real challenges that they had to address. But they took the same approach to addressing them, and it wasn't working, which was essentially to take a status quo approach to the budget, a status quo approach to spending, and to sort of hope that the deficit would gradually decline over time by itself. So what we show in our report is absolutely independent of COVID. Through the first several years in government, there's been much more continuity than there has been change. And that's always an interesting thing to look out for when there's a change in government.
Okay, I'm going to hold you there because I've got to cut to commercial break and we'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm joined again by Ben Eisen, Senior Fellow with the Frasier Institute, comparing the Doug Ford fiscal situation with that of its previous Liberal governments, I guess most recently the Kathleen Wynne-led government. And again, I appreciate the context you provided before commercial break. A little other thing, you suggest there's very little difference in terms of fiscal management style, if you will, or outputs between Kathleen Wynne and Doug Ford. You know, I remember during that election, people used to refer, and in the lead up to the election, people would refer to Kathleen Wynne as Santa Claus because she was really doling out a lot of money with program spending. But, you know, I think Doug Ford perhaps maybe earns that title a little bit more. Maybe he should. I don't know. And again, I'm all for unity. I like party unity. I love when people come together, but not when it's burying our province in debt. I have concerns about that. So let's tackle that a bit more. You were just before the commercial break, you wanted to discuss a little bit more of that thought. Continue on.
Well, it's always an interesting thing to look out for when there's a change in government. Sometimes changes in government bring about very large changes in public policy and the approach to governance. You think back to Ontario in the 1990s for a very obvious example. When the Ray government was replaced by the Harris government, there was a very substantial change in the direction. People can disagree if it was good or bad, but it was a big change. There was change. Other times, there's continuity. If you look to what happened, for instance, in Alberta, and I won't get into the weeds because it's an Ontario program. Actually, we're national, so by all means, if you want. Excuse me. Our discussion was about Ontario, I should have said. But what happened in Alberta when the NDP government replaced the prior progressive conservative government under governments like Redford and Stelmach, there was, again, continuity. There wasn't a big change in the way that the government performed. So there's continuity sometimes, and sometimes there's big time change. And in the case of Ontario, with the transition from Wynne to Ford, it doesn't matter how you look at it. And even though their rhetorical styles are so very different, if you say, was there continuity or was there change, you have to say there was continuity. Very little change in terms of their approach to debt, spending, and overall fiscal policy.
And again, just to question this point, so can the Doug Ford-led government really be faulted for their lack of debt and spending management in the time of COVID?
Yes, I think so, because when we look at the budget and we break it down, it isn't just COVID where we see this similar approach. In every area of public management, there hasn't been fundamental major reform. There's been no effort to really look at government and say, what are we doing and how can we do it differently? If you were to compare the budgets, you would essentially, between the most recent budget of the Ford government and the last budget of its predecessors, you would assume that the new government basically thought that the old government was running the province well, that there was nips and tucks here and there, but we're going to keep the same tax structure. We're not going to really reduce spending anywhere. We're not going to introduce major policy reforms. You would think that the new government was more or less pleased with the prior approach and had some small changes around the margins that they would like to make. So absolutely. And this isn't to say that the Ford government hasn't faced difficult circumstances. In many respects, it has. But they ran and they made promises about fixing the province's finances. And it's very reasonable, even though that's a hard job, to measure their performance against their own stated goals. And they haven't achieved it. And certainly any look at the numbers shows that that's not just because of COVID. COVID's made it worse.
Right, of course.
But you take that out of the equation, you still got a serious problem.
Well, let's look at some of those numbers. Your report suggested the Ford government's 2021 budget will see a spending increase of 8.5% over the next 3 years. And that's compared to 6.6% under McGuinty in a similar period. And again, that period of that 2008-2009 recession. Can you expand on that, the McGuinty recession spending?
Yeah, very similar circumstances and very similar responses. Look, there's nothing easy about governing in the wake of the 2008-2009 recession. There's nothing easy about governing in the wake of COVID. These are hard. But still, it's relevant, given the promise to do something different this time, to look at whether or not they actually have. And as you just showed with the numbers, actually, the McGuinty government did more to tighten its belt right after the 2008-2009 recession than the Ford government has done, which is sort of hard to believe given how much debt was piled up at the time. But the numbers show it quite clearly. They're very close, but if you had to say who did more, it was the McGuinty government. So following that recession in 2008, 2009, the next few years, the plan was, okay, we're going to hold spending down. We're not going to grow as quickly as before. and we'll hope the deficit shrinks over time. And that's exactly the same plan that the Ford government has introduced in its 2021 budget, except it's not being quite as, it's going a little bit further than the McGuinty government did in permitting spending to continue to grow. So the two approaches post-recession are very similar. If anything, though, the Ford government is more cautious and less serious about eliminating the deficit quickly.
Okay, well, we're going to pick up this discussion right when we return from this commercial break. Please stick around. Welcome back. We're trying to unpack just what is going on with the Ontario debt and spending. And joining me again is Ben Eisen, Senior Fellow with the Frasier Institute. And thank you very much again, Ben, for joining me. You're giving us some excellent insight. So when we talk about the similarities or the continuity of style of governing when it comes to debt and spending with the McGuinty-Wynne government and now through the Doug Ford government, what types of programs is the current government spending on, and how similar or different is this to the McGuinty-Wynne government?
Yeah, I think that one place you have to start, and whenever you're considering how can governments balance their balance the books and eliminate deficits, one thing you have to start by looking at is whether or not the governments in question have taken a similar approach to public sector compensation. The wages and salaries of people working in government are by far the largest expense. And so there's no real way to address that issue, the issue of public finances, without looking at that metric, regardless of your position or what you're trying to achieve or how you feel about it. If you want to eliminate the deficit, as the Ford government promised to do when running, that's somewhere you have to start, because it takes up about half of government spending.
Right.
And there's essentially no real change on that. We have research showing that public sector employees in Ontario enjoy a wage premium relative to similar workers in the private sector of just over 10%. That hasn't changed during the Ford government several years in office. There's been continuity on that point. So no real effort has been made to rein in spending on public sector compensation, at least not any that's shown up yet in the data in terms of overall gap between public and private compensation. Outside of that, it's not so much that there's any specific area where there's been more growth or anything like that. The issue is that there's been no changes.
Right.
All the major areas of public management, really healthcare, education, and these are obviously very important areas, but that's where the bulk of spending's taken place. There's been no real effort to look and reform and say, hey, what can we do to get higher quality public services while spending less, which is the promise that was made. And again, it's hard, but it's reasonable to measure governments against their promises. That's what was done in the 1990s in Ottawa. Under Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. It was what was done and this is a bipartisan or multi-partisan thing. It's not just one party that did it. It was obviously Liberal government under Chrétien. Same thing happened in the 90s under Mike Harris in Ontario. It was a comprehensive program review in terms of looking and saying, where are we spending? Where can we reduce? And how can we do things differently? And that's just something, it's a process that the Ford government has chosen not to undertake, to fundamentally look at the different dimensions of government spending and say, what can we do to deliver high quality public services without higher taxes and at lower costs so that we can actually afford them. Well, it's a process that they haven't gone through and that they'll have to if they ever want to get rid of the deficit.
Well, I recall, and I'm sure you do as well, it must have been the first year of the Ford government, so 2018, 2019, it seemed that there were some attempts made to bring spending under control. And I don't even agree with this attempted measure, but I remember he was trying to cut some of the autism funding. And again, I disagreed with that, but that's an attempt, I guess one could say, to curb spending. But then he backtracked, and I think rightfully so. But then he attempted a few other times to curb certain things, but then backtracked. Is this just public pressure saying, no, we actually want more spending? And is this a government being responsive? Or do they have a higher calling to the bottom line to really keep things in shape here, in check with our debt and deficit?
Well, what I'll say is, firstly, I think you're right on in noting that even when you're trying to reduce spending, priorities are important, and maintaining enough money for families with autism is the wrong place to cut. There's lots of places in government to reduce spending other than that, in my view. But still, your broader point very much holds. Their first budget, it still didn't go as far as I think they committed to when they were running for office, but it was a change in direction. The first budget when they took office, stopped the growth in nominal, that means without adjusting for inflation. It stopped the growth in spending almost completely. It slowed it down compared to what was happening under Wynne, and it developed a realistic, Wynne and McGuinty, I should say, it developed a realistic plan to start shrinking the deficit over time. And I would say that the first budget represented a small but meaningful change in direction that would have put Ontario on a different track than it's turned out to be on. Subsequently, that level of fiscal discipline that seemed to be coming in, which was still, again, less than was promised, but different from the predecessors, it's been more or less abandoned. The last budget is indistinguishable, in my view, from the budgets of 2015, 2016, 2017. So you're right, there were early signs in 2018, 2019 that there might be a slightly different approach that would have meaningfully different effects. Since then, any willingness to exercise that kind of discipline or make hard decisions surrounding it has been thrown out the window. Whether that's because of political pressure or anything else, I can't speculate on that. All I can do is talk about what the numbers tell us, which is that to the extent that there was an effort, and I think there was, to put Ontario on a different track with respect to deficit and debts, that's no longer really with us as part of Ontario governance.
Okay, well, we're going to pick up this discussion in just a few moments. Stick around. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion with Ben Eisen, Senior Fellow with the Frasier Institute, on his recent report on Ontario's debt and spending under the Ford government as it mirrors the McGuinty-Wynne years. So, I mean, I don't want to sound negative, and I always love to give credit where credit is due. So are there any areas where Premier Doug Ford deserves credit for reining in spending?
Yeah, I think that there's specific areas where some credit is due. And particularly the most important way in which I would say credit is due is that in the immediate years coming up to the recession, the Wynne government was cranking up spending more. In the immediate years leading up to the election, the Wynne government was cranking up spending more. There was sort of a pre-election spending binge after a long period of sort of trying to hold spending growth down to shrink the deficit over time. Then finally, in the last couple of years, though even what discipline did exist was thrown out the window, and we saw large spending increases over the course of 1 or 2 years right before the Ford government took office. And what the Ford government did when it took office is it did break away from that trajectory, which would have really put Ontario, if we continued it, onto a much worse path. So the Ford government went back to the approach of trying to at least maintain spending growth, trying to hold it down and shrink the deficit over time, as opposed to what happened in the very late years of the Wynne government, which was to more or less completely abandon deficit control and in fact have the deficit growing again after years of trying to shrink it. So if I'm thinking about where credit is due with respect to fiscal policy, I'd say that's the most important one, that we had started to go back again on a very dangerous path of very rapid spending growth and rapid increases in the deficit. And the government did stop that and return to approach of at least trying to stop the deficit from growing and trying to shrink it over time. So it was a break from the last couple years of the Wynne government when there was a real pre-election spending binge. So I do give credit for arresting that and going back to what was happening in the previous years, which still wasn't great, but it was better than the real spending surge we saw at the end of the Wynne government.
And of course, it's not abnormal or unusual, I think is a better phrase, to see governments as they're in the final year prior to election, their election year, to increase spending. And of course, the election is less than a year away, to start handing out candy. Like, I think this is where Kathleen Wynne earned that name, Santa Claus, for handing out all this spending. But then again, I recall in the 2028 election, you know, some of the sharpest criticism was for Kathleen Wynne and her out-of-control spending, and it came from actually Doug Ford himself. I also recall that he ran on an open for business, Ontario's open for business policy. And then I know we're not really discussing COVID here, but it has been said that through his policies now with COVID, and this definitely can't be helping the situation, that he has closed the most businesses of any premier in Ontario's history. Is that accurate? And how would that impact our deficit?
Well, certainly business performance has an effect on the deficit. If businesses are doing well, they're thriving, they're paying corporate income tax, the people that they're able to pay more money to pay more personal income tax. You have fewer people relying on social assistance. So absolutely, being open for business has a big effect on the bottom line. And I think it is an important point to raise because in addition to not keeping the promise of reducing the deficit, I don't think the Ford government has succeeded in broadly implementing policies that would help the provinces have a competitive business environment and grow. It hasn't addressed the very high personal income taxes that make it difficult to attract and retain people to the province. It hasn't taken major steps to boost competitiveness and to address corporate taxes relative to our peers in the region. So I would say that the promise and the business performance of the last year or so, a year and a half, that's very difficult to criticize the government for. But we can look at the policies and say, are these policies the ones that have historically been proven to actually generate job growth and actually help more businesses open and thrive? And there's just not a lot of evidence. Again, it's just more continuity than change. It's doing a lot of the same things as its predecessors. No careful look at corporate welfare and how to get rid of it and replace it with broad-based tax cuts. Those sorts of big steps that you see when governments really want to make a change and help all businesses thrive. We haven't seen very much in that respect.
Okay, last 10 seconds we have. What would you like to see in one sentence? What would you like to see out of this government?
Meeting its promises of reducing the deficit and the debt that we're going to pass along to future generations.
Okay, Ben Eisen, Senior Fellow with Frasier Institute, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Well, many Ontarians expected Premier Doug Ford to follow in the footsteps of his predecessor, Premier Mike Harris, to cut spending and manage program spending and show some restraint. 3 years in, it seems we're still waiting, and that's COVID aside. Well, for Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.